So to me, these papers are studies of the memory of the civil rights movement turned to political ends. And I take that to be what the study of the memory of the civil rights movement should be, which is to say that studies of the memory of the movement in service of the goals of the civil rights movement in our own present. Both draw on contemporary political and legal theory, especially theories of justice and restorative justice, and both use a framework of responsibility, indirectly or directly. Renee is the more explicit of the two on memory, arguing that, quote, justice in the present requires us to remember historical injustices and recognize how they continue to shape identities and structures in the present, unquote. Larry is the more direct on responsibility. Quote, we may not be responsible for our region's past, but we, who else possibly could be, are responsible for a present impregnated by the past, a past that maims and destroys and kills precisely because of its past, unquote. That present, which is the legacy of the unfinished agenda of the civil rights movement, is marked by deep racial inequalities that pervasively and systemically disadvantage African Americans as to employment, education, health care, even life and death, as Larry tells us for those statistics that he gave us for Mississippi and the South generally. The most stunning of which is that 44% of Black Mississippians, as recently as 2006 and 2007, were defined as officially poor. One reason to think in terms of a long, if changing, civil rights movement is because the movement was responding to a long, if changing, history of racial inequality and injustice, was responding, and still is and might be into the future responding, which I think is the import of these two papers. Renee's phrase for memory in service of social change or the goals of the movement in the present is memory work. And what we learned from these papers is that memory work has taken a number of forms: struggles over the form and content of commemorative occasions and sites, criminal justice trials of those who have committed crimes of racial violence, truth and reconciliation commissions, and reparations. Let me just pause and ask. I hear kind of a feedback. Do you hear a feedback? No? Okay, good. What I value most about these papers and what I want to focus on in my comment is the ways they help us think expansively and critically about responsibility for and who is responsible for past injustices, present inequalities, and future remedies. In the interest of time, and frankly, reflecting my time to prepare these comments and really think through all the provocative issues that they raised, I'm going to focus on three forms as they relate to the question of expanding conceptions of responsibility. So first, criminal justice trials. They are the form that has made the most headway, and they are taken seriously by most Americans as as a way to redress some of the wrongs of the civil rights era. And they now have the force of some funds behind them in the form of, as Larry told us, the Till Bill. They are also a form of redress that has been studied critically by scholars, most notably Renee herself. And this research finds promise, but also sounds notes of caution in terms of the efficacy of memory work for social change. Certainly, criminal justice trials are a valuable form of redress for the families of those most directly harmed by the killings. But not only for the families, for what we know about the history of racial violence in the United States is that it aimed to send a message to a wider community, a message that discouraged challenges to the racial status quo. So bringing the perpetrators to justice sends the opposite message, that racial crimes directed at activists should not go unpunished. But these trials also can have the impact of focusing the blame solely on those who actually pulled the trigger, thus obscuring the larger forces behind them and leading to a catharsis without any responsibility taking from the wider community and the state forces that sanction violence. Taking place as they do within a criminal justice framework, these trials people the world in terms of the guilty and the innocent, with only the guilty, or more accurately, the most guilty, being held responsible. Moreover, When a death becomes the standard of harm to be addressed, it can, although it certainly doesn't have to, set a very high bar for establishing a harm worthy of redress, a standard by which other less spectacular, although far more pervasive, harms pale in comparison. Thus, one question for discussion is, what are the possibilities and limitations of the criminal justice system for opening up discussions of responsibility? And let me pause and just say here that for those of us who are commenting on sessions at this conference, we were asked, as well as commenting, to pose potential questions for the discussion period. So then a second form of memory work is the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. They've also had a beginning, although a fairly small beginning, on only local levels. Larry notes of these local TRCs that some appear to have made a genuine difference, at least in their own communities. Of the Philadelphia Coalition, Renee notes that outcomes have included a greater voice for African Americans in political decision-making in Philadelphia, Mississippi today. If we think of one goal of the civil rights movement, to have been the political empowerment of the previously disenfranchised, then this is memory work in service of the movement today. What I found most intriguing in Renee's paper is her observation that the TRC process in Philadelphia has been used towards the goal of expanding conceptions of responsibility, fingering state officials for their part in the triple murder of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. There's even more promise reflected in the Declaration of Intent adopted just in January of this year by the Mississippi Truth Project, in that it casts an even wider net as to who is responsible and for what actions in the civil rights era. And the Mississippi Truth Project is a group hoping to form a statewide TRC in Mississippi, which is one of the groups that Larry alluded to without naming it as such. The Declaration maintains, quote, "Too often stories are told of this time focusing on individuals, not institutions. While it is true that vigilantes terrorize the night, it is also true that public officials and community leaders shape the daily experience of oppression," unquote. Even more telling is the list of practices that constitutes the scope of harm done. So another quote from this declaration. "Many practices consciously and unconsciously oppressed a large segment of the population. These practices resulted in crimes against the body, crimes against property, the collusion of public and private institutions in preventing access and opportunity to all people, and conspiracies of silence," unquote. So this language of access and opportunity, daily experiences of oppression, takes us well beyond the scope most commonly assigned to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which is to deal with acts of violence and more spectacular forms of human rights abuses. So a second question for discussion might be, what are the possibilities of using the TRC structure to address systemic and institutionalized forms of inequality? Renee notes that STAR helps Southern communities adapt the TRC process to their local needs. So just how creatively and expansively might TRCs be used?